connaissance, recherche,
sciences,
des sciences,
mathématiques,
théorie,
physique,
philosophie, conférences,
archéologie, nature.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be part of this event. This is a very exciting couple days. I really look forward to hearing about all these projects from all over the world and all these different topics. So this project is a little bit different than the majority of the projects that we're hearing, in that it's not actually an impact evaluation, but instead it's using a randomized approach to answer a really important policy question. But it's not, there's nothing in here that is about the effectiveness of aid per se. This is joint work with Jonathan Zinman from Dartmouth. So I started off writing this, and I realized after I did this that some of these issues would be, some of this description is very much covered by what Abhijit just presented about. But I'm going to talk broadly about a couple different projects in here, but focus on one main one. And I think it helps to start off by just understanding what we mean when we say microcredit. So microcredit, in a very rough definition to many people, is loans to women to help start, grow enterprises. Now, each of those words, though, is debated in terms of what actually it means when we say microcredit. Well, not every single one of those words, but you know, certainly women is not obviously something that is embedded in the word microcredit, but yet the majority of programs that we see are focused on women. And the issue about whether they are really targeting entrepreneurs to start or grow microenterprises is very much a big issue, partly because of the fungibility of money and partly because of the design of programs. There are a lot of programs out there that call themselves microcredit, but yet do not target micro-entrepreneurs, might just make untargeted loans to individuals. And the first project I'm going to talk about here, which was our first foray into testing sensitivity to interest rates. How do I get rid of this? Okay. Is exactly that. It's in a program that was not the kind of canonical description of microcredit, in the sense that it was not targeting micro-entrepreneurs. So, you know, why microcredit? And this really gets at the heart of this question about interest rates. Is, you know, the reason why microcredit has received so much attention, or one of the reasons, is because of its inherent argument for sustainability. That because it's loans, not grants, and can attract investor capital, the argument thus goes that, you know, maybe we should see it like the Apple sellers, to use Abhijit's example. And for the reasons that Abhijit put forward, we obviously do not think that that puts it above the, you know, above reproach from asking what its effectiveness is as an aid program. But when we now get into thinking about what makes it sustainable, implicitly what we're talking about here is, what are the interest rates? What are the prices that people are paying for these services? And how do those prices affect who we reach and the sustainability of these programs? So one of the things that's most striking about microcredit is, given all of the rhetoric, it's usually very surprising to people to learn how few people actually use the services when offered. In a typical marketplace, in many places, most of the places in the world, there are exceptions. For instance, like Bangladesh and Bolivia seem to have far higher levels of penetration than other areas. But it is the case that there's aims for hundreds and hundreds and millions, but those who are not receiving the services but actually have access, the number is much, much bigger. And so the question remains, why is that? What is it about the services that for many people, they say no? And when we look at this from the demand side of the equation, we want to think about, what is it about the terms of credit that are attractive or not to individuals? How much of it is about mere price versus other components, such as flexibility or marketing? So we also see a huge variance in rates around the world. And I'm not going to get into this in this paper, other than to note that there really is just a tremendous variation. What we see, and the rates that we just saw in India at 24% APR are very low in the microfinance world, very low. India and Bangladesh kind of stand out, I think, roughly. Maybe there's a few other places, no doubt. But those stand out on the very low end of the spectrum in terms of interest rates. In most of the programs in Africa that we've worked, in sub-Saharan Africa, not including South Africa, we've seen rates that hover between 30 to 70%. In South Africa, we see the rates go up to 200% APR. Latin America tends to be right in the middle. The programs we've worked with that are both NGOs and for-profits, the interest rates range typically from 70 to 120. Right? And this is irrespective of whether it's a for-profit or non-profit. And so the idea there, although we don't have really good studies on this, is that this is very much driven by costs, the difference across these countries, in the cost structure in terms of running organizations and the labor costs for kind of what you need for middle management, credit officer type individuals who are the workforce behind these programs. So we have this huge variance. We also have a huge variance in the depth of outreach. We do see huge penetration in Bangladesh, and like I said, in a lot of places in Latin America and Africa, it's very striking how many people have a branch of a microfinance institution readily available and yet do not choose to borrow. So there's clearly two sides to the calculation when we want to think about this issue. We want to think about it from a bank's perspective in terms of the cost structure of the bank. What is the marginal cost of issuing a loan? These are small loans, and there is a lot of labor that does go into them. So you just add up the costs, and it's pretty high, particularly when the wages required to hire a good credit officer are high when you have depending on what the labor structure is like in the country. But there is a flip side too on the demand side. We can't just look at it at the calculations just looking at one side of the coin. How sensitive to price are individuals as we lower the price? It's really one of the most fundamental questions in economics that we tend to try to think about in terms of estimating is what is the elasticity of demand for credit? And so for years, the most important line on the screen is being cut off, my apologies. But for years, the World Bank, led by CdF, have been pushing microfinance organizations to raise their rates. For many years, that was kind of the punchline of their recommendation, was you need to be sustainable, and that means raising interest rates. The very first time that I ever got involved, in fact, in some respect, the aha moment that led me to doing this study was an experience in South Africa in 2000. I was in graduate school. I was working with a lender who wanted to do a randomized controlled trial to evaluate the impact of their program. So I would go out in the field, and I had a team of people who would go out and find clients who said they would agree to borrow at the interest rate that the lender was offering rates at, which at that time was about 160%, if I remember. And the organization was growing, and they were learning what they were doing. And I would go out for a month, get a whole bunch of people who said they wanted to borrow, bring their applications into the bank. And then the bank said, well, you know what, we just raised our interest rates. And they went from 160 to 180. And then a month later, they went up to 200. And they kept raising them. And I was getting very frustrated. And I asked them, why do you keep doing this? And he said, well, I have to reach sustainability. And I said, well, but how do you know that this is actually going to help you get there? Maybe this is actually going to make things worse. You realize, as price goes up, demand goes down. As price goes up, you also get riskier clients, and you could inspire more moral hazard and higher default rates. And the quote, which has been like planted firmly in my head, was that was academic babble. And so, it was that conversation, no joking aside, that did very much motivate this set of projects. Was saying, well, this really is a very fundamental, deep question, and if there is this much controversy over what the sensitivity is at interest rates, both in terms of demand and the portfolio quality, then we need better evidence. Okay, so the arguments that people usually give to justify high rates are sometimes twofold. The first is comparison to moneylender rates. So take the example of the moneylender rates that Abhijit quoted, 3.85% from Spandana per month. Those are very high. There's a fundamental difference, though. This is really a false comparison. Very few people literally sit there in moneylender debt nonstop for the same length of time that they spend when they borrow from a microfinance institution. Moneylender debt is more flexible. You can take it down and draw it down and pay it back in a more flexible way. So if you look at the total interest cost that you spend, even when the nominal interest rate is higher, it doesn't turn out to be nearly as expensive. It only is expensive when you want to convert things into APR context. The second is that there's this argument in general that the poor simply are not sensitive to price. And this is the one that really strikes us as having just lacking serious evidence to really support that the poor wouldn't be sensitive to price. Why wouldn't they be sensitive to price of loans when they're sensitive to the price of so many other things? We've seen this. We're going to see it tomorrow, I think, or later today on bed nets. And there's tremendous evidence from other areas that people will be sensitive to price, and these are serious prices. This can lead to significant changes in consumption when you're talking about interest rates at this level. And the other argument that one makes comes from trying to look at what the returns to capital are. And this is where a series of projects that have been led by Danel, McKenzie, and Woodruff have provided us some nice insight in terms of what the distribution and average returns to capital are. So if someone is borrowing at 80, 100% a year for an enterprise, implicitly, for them to be better off, if this is strictly being thought of as an enterprise loan, that means their returns to capital are really, really high. And so recent evidence is showing that in Mexico and Sri Lanka, the returns to capital were coming in around 60 to 70% on average, clearly meaning that for some people higher and some people lower, which does tend to suggest that interest rates at this range might make sense, but clearly not for everyone. And the question is, what happens and how many more people are being picked up as we move around these interest rates? Okay, so ultimately this is an empirical question. And it's also, why are we doing this as an experiment? Well, first of all, suppose we wanted to do something really naive and compare across institutions. This would be deeply problematic because of the different targeting methods of different programs, different loan products on non-price dimensions, different competitive landscapes, different corporate reputation and value to the borrower. This would be a very false comparison to just look at two institutions with two different interest rates and think that we can learn something about whether the interest rate differential itself is driving any difference in performance of those two institutions. Similarly, if we look within institution, a lot of times we see different products with different prices. But inevitably, there's more than just the price that differs. There's many other features, many of the same very issues that will differ across institutions, differ within institution across products. And so for that same reason, it's very rare that we would ever find a situation within an institution with variation in price that allows us to estimate this properly. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the first project we did in this to whet your appetite for kind of what got us started. And this actually tells you a little bit about the way I've been thinking about these projects in general. That this is a perfect example where if we did this study in one place, in one country, in one point in time, we by no means would have the answer. Right? This is not a question that has a singular answer. It's an answer that's going to depend on the context of a situation, and the key is to try to understand what that context is that's really going to drive this answer so that we can go to new places where we don't have to do an experiment every place and be able to say, aha, well, in this type of context with this underlying environment, this should be, we can use the data and the evidence from other places. So the first study we did this in was in South Africa. And as a result of this, CGAP came to us and said, will you do more of these? Right? This was interesting. We learned a lot, but hey, it's just South Africa. It's just one place. We want to see this in more locations. We want to see this in Africa. We want to see it in Latin America. We want to see it in high competition, rural areas, urban, etc. So basically what this study did is we basically copied what a lot of consumer finance companies do in America. And we mailed out 58,168 direct mail letters to prior clients. Most received lower rates. A very few received higher rates, higher than their normal. These were all prior clients. It was a one-time offer with about a 1-month window to apply. So this is an example of letters that they received. We also randomized various other things on this letter, for instance, whether there was a photo of the woman or not, and whether the table was kind of more complicated with lots of choices or fewer choices. And so here's the basic demand curve on take-up, and what you see is a slowly decreasing downward sloping demand curve. It did and basically once we rose above a certain level, you see what one could argue is a kink, and that kink is right at the normal interest rate, so that when you raised it above what they had borrowed in the past, the demand dropped way off. Revenues, on the other hand, basically, well, first of all, at the higher end, the sample size is simply too small to draw any strong inference. But at everything lower than normal up to normal, you see that the revenue, the profit maximizing move for the firm was to actually be exactly where they were. That there was a downward sloping demand curve. They did pick up more clients, but they didn't pick up enough more clients in order to overcome the reduction in interest on the existing clients that would have borrowed anyhow. So you know, as much as I like the study, there's some issues, and there's reasons why we want to explore doing this in other places. So the first is what I already mentioned, which is just the need for doing it in more places with more different contexts. But there's also something that's very nice about what we've done in the paper I'm about to just get into more detail, which is that this was a one-shot offer, and so we had people's attention at a particular moment in time, and we get to see their reaction in that kind of very controlled moment in which they received this letter. What we're going, so one could say, for instance, that this is only that we're going to underestimate demand from a process like that, because we're only going to pick up the demand curve, or a downward sloping demand curve, for those who were paying attention at the time they received the mail. Now, we do know that people were paying attention in some respects. It wasn't that they literally just threw it away as junk mail. And one way we know this is actually from that photo of the woman I showed you right here. So she was incredibly powerful making people borrow. So we know that they were at least paying attention to something on the letters and not throwing them away. So if you got that photo of the woman, then it made you if you were a man, it made you just as likely to borrow as dropping your interest rate by 4.3 percentage points per month, which was a third of the interest cost of this loan. So clearly there was some attention being paid. But having said that, it is still a short-term window here that we were examining demand, not an ongoing process of just of seeing what happens for an entire branch as you lower interest rates, which gets us to the next to this project. So the key difference with what we're going to do here and what the results I'm going to show you from Compartamos was that we randomized at the branch level, and data were collected over 19 months. From the administrative data, where we just get to observe at the branch level what happens to the growth, the profits, the costs, the revenues of the branch. There's two different take-up sets of data that I'm going to share with you. The first comes from specific face-to-face marketing, where marketing representatives from Compartamos went out into the field, did little mini surveys with people, and we get to observe whether those individuals take up. And the second is simply from the administrative data of Compartamos, seeing what is the total aggregate number of clients, loan size, and default, and hence total revenue, total cost at the branch level. And so, what we like about this is that this is a natural overtime process. It includes all the general equilibrium effects that one may expect to take place. It includes all the gossip that you want to have happen, where it's not just one person and their response to a loan offer, but it's the 19-month consequence of lowering interest rates for an entire community. So let me tell you a little bit about the loan product and Compartamos. And these photos are all, by the way, Carlos, my apologies if I should have stolen from your website. Crédito Mujer is village banking loan product. Crédito Mujer means loan for women. Village banking loan product, it's only allowed for women. The bank branches were grouped into 80 geographic clusters, and a cluster was basically one or two branches typically. It was when there was two branches that were just right next to each other, they were grouped together and treated as one. Half of the clusters were assigned a high rate and half a low rate. The high rate was their normal rate. The low rate was a lowering of the rate. We did several orthogonality checks across the data that were available at the time. The study branches, it's important to note that this was not the entirety of all the branches through Compartamos. They were chosen to be across the country. We removed the very, very largest branches from the study just because there was really we had a strong sense that would be a large determining factor in later outcomes, and we did not have enough really large banks in order to be able to make that necessarily perfectly balanced. We also only have the middle competition branches. Middle competition, what Compartamos has 3 different categories for the way it internally categorizes its branches based on the competitive landscape. But the majority of the branches are coded up as being in the middle category. And so again, because of sample size issues, the analysis is going to, the sample frame, we decided to stick simply with the middle competition areas. So here's a simple map of Mexico with the 132 branch offices and 80 geographic clusters, and just showing you the treatment control assignments across the country. The rough timeline, as I mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and skip this. It just took 19 months, and we have monthly data throughout the entire process. So the terms of the loan, borrowers may already have a business or plan to start one, just as similar to Spondon in that sense. The loans range from 1,000 to 20,000 pesos, $75 to $1,500, and the average loan is $550. 16 weekly payments, and there are group meetings and group liability for the members of the group. In groups are average around 20 people, I believe. Is that right, Carlos? Okay. Borrowers range from 18 to 98. I'm kind of skeptical on that one. I was curious. But the average of 40, 3 children. There's a lot of repeat borrowing that happens, average of 5 loans with Compartamos, a typical client. And very standard microenterprise type businesses that we're seeing here. Sell of food items, handicrafts, restaurants, bakeries, corner stores. 2/3 are in urban areas, and 1/4 are in rural, and 10% somewhere in between. So here's, oops, it's not translating nicely. So I want to give you a sense. So Compartamos, to be perfectly blunt, has received a lot of negative attention because of interest rates. And this is what I find an interesting chart in that it shows you the landscape of interest rates in Mexico. And it shows you that even comparing Compartamos NGOs to other NGOs and quasi-banks, the interest rates are really dead on, if not slightly below, a lot of the competitors, whether NGOs or not. So the issue about interest rates is, Compartamos has gotten a lot of the attention in particular because they went public and did an IPO. But the fact is, the controversy really just applies to microfinance in general, and what the interest rate policies in general should be, not to Compartamos in particular. So the columns the 3rd and 4th column, these are data that come from the mixed market on the web. It's a website that basically collects all sorts of data from microfinance institutions around the world. And they have a financial revenue ratio which comes off of the financial statements, basically looks at total financial revenue and divides by assets. And so it's not looking at the loan products themselves to see how they're actually marketed, but looks at just the financial statements. And the final column comes from looking at the way products are actually offered to individuals and how they're reported in terms of disclosure. And there you see Compartamos, including tax, was at 103%, which is on the low end of this range. So here are the specific interest rates that were offered. Now, note that there's not 103 up here. This is without the tax, and that's the reason for the difference. So basically, there was low and high, and as you can see, there's basically about a 10 percentage point spread between the low and the high in terms of the random assignment. And then the way this works is different clients are categorized as either gold, silver, or bronze, and then they are given different interest rates as well, based on their tenure with Compartamos and the quality of their prior repayments. But regardless of what level they're in, as you can see, the change that was actually enacted was simply a 5.5% drop in their monthly flat interest rate, which converts into about a 10% annualized differential between the high and the low interest rates. Okay, so the data that we have come from the administrative data, the take-up data. The competition data, which I'm going to show you, comes from working with the branch managers in each of the branches and using their local knowledge of their competition that they get from knowing knowing their market, knowing their clients, knowing who they lose people to, who they steal people from, et cetera, and getting information from them about what the terms of credit are about each of the competitive branches. We also have two other sources of data, which I'm not going to be presenting here today, but we're working with, but they're on credit bureau and government loan data. And that is to try to get at a final question, which is really important from a policy perspective, which is, as you lower the interest rates, if you do bring in more clients, are you bringing in more clients that were not borrowing otherwise, actually creating more aggregate demand for credit in the market, or are you simply stealing from competitors, right? And so you can see from a policymaker's perspective, this is actually a really important question, irrespective of whether it's profitable or not for a given bank. Okay, so I'm first going to show you some very, very straightforward bar chart comparison of means to just whet your appetite for what we're going to see in a bit with the econometrics. So this comes from the face-to-face marketing, where an individual credit officer, marketing agent would go into the field, visit an individual, do a very brief survey with them to try to measure their poverty level, and then offer them lower high interest rates. And as you can see, the take-up rate goes from 15 to about 22.5%, which is a very significant increase, 50% improvement in the likelihood that they take out a loan based on being in from a low to a high interest rate. This comes from the administrative data. If we just look at the total number of clients per cluster per month, we see a statistically significant improvement from about 4,000 up to about 4,800. So again, that's about a 20% increase in simply the number of clients. And similarly, when we look at total loan amount per cluster per month, this is not average. So this is including both the new client effect as well as larger loans, and we see an increase. Finally, when we look at profits, what we see is, so first of all, notice in a series of bar charts, and these are the 6-month averages over time. And the thing to pay particular attention to is just that the gap between the two is shrinking. And as I'll show you when we get to the econometrics, at the end of the day, this is not statistically significant, the increase in profits, but it is a positive number. So if you look at the very beginning, the low rates just by, they're not statistically, there's no difference statistically between the two, but the low rates were lower, had lower profits to start with than the high rates. So sorry, let me skip those two. So I want to, yeah. No, sorry. Go back. Okay, so this is just showing you snapshots, summary statistics for the 12-month and then the very end of the study at the 19-month point. So when we just look at the snapshots from so this is really throwing away a lot of data. We're just comparing the mean number of clients at 12 and mean number of clients at 19. And you see that the low rate has more. Neither of these are statistically significant. The one thing that is important to note is when we do look at the differential demand for the people below the poverty line versus above, I'll show you this, and I'll show you later results, are not going to find any differences there. We're not finding that as you lower rates, it changes the composition of who is brought in, but it does bring in more clients. Same thing with number of groups. So the average loan size also is increasing, and here both average loan of all clients, average loan of retained clients, as well as the final row, which is average loan of new clients. All three we're seeing increases. On delinquency, we are finding some evidence, although it's very, very small, that the lowering of rates increases the quality of the portfolio. When we look at the econometrics, these results are not significant. But we do see the first row shows us delinquency on any pre-existing loan from 6% down to 5%. And at 12 months, at 19 months, that effect went away. Delinquency, then what we wanted to do here is we're trying to split out the analysis based on how much of the group is new versus old. And the key here is to try to separate out adverse selection from moral hazard a little bit. Now, we can't directly test for adverse selection, but we can try to get at moral hazard by looking at the groups that started off high and got kind of, quote, surprised with a low rate. And we have no clean test of adverse selection in this setting since it's always going to be confounded with moral hazard. But as but we're still not, the punchline is, despite the effort to try to do this, we're not really seeing, important economic differences between these. Okay, so now in terms of total costs and interest income and profits, again, like I mentioned before, we're seeing we're seeing the whoops, where did that go? No, that's not matching what I thought it would match. My apologies. Let me skip to the econometrics. So on the face-to-face marketing, we have these marketing reps that went out for Compartamos, did field visits to clients, and did this mini survey on poverty. And so here's the basic results. And the reason we did this in particular was because we really wanted to get some measure of individual poverty in order to see whether the sensitivity was different for those who are above or below the poverty line. So the overall difference went from 18 to 22, from 22 to 15%, low rate to high rate. On the second row, we look at those who have high poverty likelihood, and we really don't see much of a difference here, going from 16 to 21%, whereas the low poverty goes from 15 to 25. So we do, I mean, it's slight, but there's really not much heterogeneity here. So as we're lowering the rates, it's not telling us that we're picking up a differential population of individuals. So the administrative data analysis now. So we have a series of different ways of trying to deal with any sort of pre-existing trends that may have been taking place in the data. And so I'm going to walk you through basically a series of robustness specifications in order to make sure that we're not just picking up something spurious. So the very first simplest analysis just shows the lower interest rate leads to 407 new clients. That's the unit of observation here is per cluster per month. When we include a control for the number of baseline clients and then do not include fixed effects for branch, the point estimate remains exactly the same. And then the final two columns, what we're doing is we're basically looking at the trends. The key here is to look at the first row, the first, the fourth, and the fifth. So we have the low interest rate, and then the low interest rate between 7 and 12 months, and then finally between 13 and 19. And as you can see, the impact of lowering the rates picks up over time. Right? We start off with 136, 129, which are not significant statistically, and then we get to add after 7 months. Then the effect goes up to 223, 228 additively, and then above that 534 and 518, depending on the specification in terms of the number of new clients per cluster per month. So we wanted to break this out. Are we bringing in new clients or just keeping old ones? Now, there's a lot of reason to think, at least in my mind, that the retained clients were less likely to have an impact on, at least that was my prior, because they've already agreed to borrow at the higher rate. And so lowering the rate, yes, that might make them happier, but it's unlikely that it's making them, that it's about their returns to capital being right in that wedge in the gap between the two, where it's actually a profitable move on one and not the other, right? Now it might be generating a sentiment of goodwill and positive feelings, and then basically they effectively reciprocate by staying in the program. But we do see a statistically significant improvement in the number of new clients and not from the number of retained clients. But we do see the same trend over time on the retained clients that we find on the overall, that this does lead to, as time goes on, more and more clients remaining. Okay, so next we look at total loan portfolio. So this is just a dollar amount of loans. And again, breaking out for new clients as well as just the total portfolio. And as we see, the total portfolio does increase. And then, this is the same analysis, but now including controls for any sort of pre-existing trends which may exist in the data, and we still find the same basic result. So now in delinquency, like I mentioned, in an ideal world, we want to separate out adverse selection from moral hazard. Those who agree to high rates are higher risk clients. The adverse selection story, moral hazard would say that higher rates motivate riskier behavior. The earlier study that I referred to in the beginning of this talk does separate those out, but it's simply not possible in this setting to do it that way. And so we do this analysis separately for existing and new borrowers. So here we have the low interest rate on any delinquency, a proportion of new clients, and then an interaction of low rate and proportion of new clients in order to see whether there's further evidence there. And we're not really finding any statistically significant results on delinquency analyzed in this way. Same thing when we look at more extreme delinquency, 90 days or more, and we find no differences here. So, altogether for Compartamos, So altogether, Compartamos is a for-profit. The impact on society is important, but the promise to investors, of course, is that helping society can be profitable, right? So we need to test that. We need to see what this all adds up to at the end of the day in terms of profits. And we do see the cost go up with the low interest rate, right? There were more clients. It does cost money to service more clients. Now, it probably doesn't cost that much more to go from group sizes of 19 to 20. There's a fixed cost of dealing with a group, and there's a low marginal cost of adding a client to an existing group. There's a high marginal cost of adding a group, right? If this is really just about making groups larger, then it would be intuitive that the cost implications would be minor. So we do see an increase in cost. We do see the increase in total interest income. Remember that's really, from a demand elasticity, that's telling you now the net effect of both the lost interest income from lowering the rates on the people who would have borrowed anyhow and adding in the extra clients and the larger loan sizes they're generating. So the net effect is positive. And then the net effect on profits is positive, but obviously it's not a statistically significant positive number. So the exercise which I just mentioned on the cost, we wanted to verify in the data just as a little bit of a reality check. And so we asked total cost in a regression on the average number of members per group as well as the total number of lending groups, and we do find exactly what we kind of expected to see up front, which is that once you put in total number of lending groups in a branch, that the average number of members per group is not a driving force for the costs, although it is positive. Okay, competitive response. So this is obviously very important. If everybody just drops their rates and just matches Compartamos, this leads to a different interpretation of what the policy implications. So these data were all collected from branch managers, and it was not an easy exercise to match this in terms of loan terms. So there's a few different ways that we tried doing this, and I'll show you a few of them. The punchline here, though, if anything, oddly enough, is that the easiest way of saying this is we're seeing no competitive response. The point estimates are actually the wrong sign. So the row of interest here is post times low interest rate in order to see, and the idea there is that should be, if competitors matched, that should have been -10, because that's basically what Compartamos dropped by, and instead we're seeing positive numbers, 10 and 14. When we the second set of columns there, what we did is, well, let's just take the absolute lowest competitor in each cluster and just call that the competitor rather than the first one, the first set, which is looking at the average of all competitors. We see a smaller positive number, but it's still positive. Now here we're restricting to only the competitors that we had both in our baseline and follow-up. We did this exercise twice. The only time that we do see this negative number but it's not significant statistically, is when we look at only loans with the same terms and same competitors in both baseline and follow-up. So when we're looking at, the same exact competitor offering 6-month loans, both reported baseline and follow-up, and looking at the changes in those exact same structure. So the aggregate demand question is in some respect from the policymaker the kind of the elephant in the room. It's one thing to show for an individual bank that you can lower rates and increase the outreach and increase profits. It's far another question to say whether this was a temporary effect that would go away after a few more years of competitive response, or whether aggregate demand has actually increased. And so the solution here is to examine credit bureau data with complete or nearly complete data at the municipality level, as well as government bank regulator data on aggregate credit. So far, the data were proving too imprecise, and so hopefully we'll be able to have that soon to add into this analysis. So the basic conclusions here is that the borrowers are shockingly elastic compared to what a lot of people's priors were. And this is true both for old and new, not just about keeping old clients, but it was also for bringing in new ones. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. The more intuitive, at least for me, was that it was going to have a big effect on bringing in new clients, but less of an effect on retaining old ones. But in fact, it did have a huge effect on retaining old ones too. There's no effect on default. Costs go up by a little, which leads to a net increase in profits. And the competitive response is noisy, and the aggregate demand so far in the analysis we've seen is noisy, but we're still getting more data there. So replication. This is what I opened up by talking a little bit about, but clearly one parameter here is not right for the whole world. The key is to understand this heterogeneity. How does this going to differ depending on the competitive landscape, returns to capital, financial literacy, disclosure policies and practices? These are all some of the key questions if you're an interest rate regulator or an investor or policymaker that has some influence somehow on interest rates policies for banks or microfinance institutions, whether for-profit or non-profit. These are the questions that you need to be asking, not just what is the point estimate, but what is the point estimate in different contexts and under different policy regimes. So we are replicating this in rural Peru, urban Manila, urban Ghana, and rural Philippines. And we'll have, I don't know when, but we'll build this knowledge hopefully over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you for also allowing me to spend a few moments trying to react a little bit to what Dean just said, and for the invitation here today. Let me just start by saying that, as you're all very aware, and by the way, this is the first time this data is made public, which was one of the intentions of this study in particular, and everything we're doing with Dean and other researchers, which is to start to say that, as my good friend Fuad has pointed out in his intervention before this, I mean, as you're all aware, microfinance was basically born out of the social sector, not the financial sector, and mostly out of the donor community and the civil society efforts in different countries to serve poor clients with financial services. Now, one of the things I think that stands out about this industry, which is now an industry that is fairly well developed and has been running for quite a bit of time, but has had very much exponential growth in the past few years. One of the things that is very specific about this industry is every mission-led industry is very passionate. And you've all heard a lot of talk through the years about how good microfinance is and about what good it does to the clients. But in fact, it has been repeatedly pointed out, most of that talk is based on anecdotes and storytelling, and very few of it is driven by facts and evidence. And I think, I think this has certain reasons why this came about. I think it's only logical to expect that a newborn industry at first is not very intensive on evidence and facts. But also I think it has to do of the genesis of this industry and having it being funded for many, many years, and still very much so by the development institutions, the international financial institutions, and even the donors, where, and I'm going to be very blunt about this, and we have been as guilty as anyone in this industry, that these anecdotes and these stories sell well to those funding this industry. I think we've gotten, thankfully, to a point where this is no longer the case. I think we're at a point where this industry, for it to go to its next phase, needs to show up a lot more than just stories and anecdotes, and I think that happens to be very good. And this is coming not only because of smarter policy decisions and smarter investment decisions, both by regular investors as well as social investors, but also I think because of the focus of the industry itself. I think in broad terms, these stories and these anecdotes have oversold what microfinance can do. I think a lot of us recognize that. I know that when we started Compartamos, we really thought, and we've actually made, a bit of our view here public a couple of years ago through a letter that we wrote called A Letter to Our Peers, which was really a letter within the industry trying to figure out a lot of these issues. And what we said there is that we started out probably thinking that our role was to change our clients' lives. And through time, I think, to be very honest, we've really understood that more than change our clients' life, what we do is we provide a space and an opportunity for them to change their lives. But we cannot claim through microfinance, through the provision of financial services, that every single client changes their lives, that every single client has a larger cash flow, a larger asset base, or in fact is better off. That at the same time, the fact that not everyone benefits or not everyone benefits at the same level is still not, for us, a strong enough reason not to do it, because we believe, again, that it is by giving people choices and by giving people tools and opportunity that they can benefit themselves. Now, one of the key discussions around in this industry that has lacked all kinds of evidence is this issue about pricing and interest rates. And it is an issue that is very controversial and that is very, to an extent, complicated and context specific. Now, it's complicated in the sense that it has these both dimensions that Dean mentioned, both the dimension about cost and supply and the dimensions about demand. And we tend to get into these kinds of discussions and throw numbers around, this interest rate or that interest rate from here to there, and that's all we talk about. That's where the discussion starts, and that's where the discussion ends. And I think, judgments of value are made based on that very superficial evidence. So our intention when we started working with Dean was to try to start solving and trying to provide a bit more data and a bit more evidence for these discussions to be a bit more valuable for the industry and for people that are looking at it. Of course, there's a side, let me address it from both sides. The sides of cost, and what you've seen here is mostly the side of demand, and I'll get to that in a second. But in terms of cost, I think the microfinance community has done a fairly good job in explaining that, $1 million loan costs less proportionally than a $100 loan. But we have done a lousy job trying to distill the very differences that are within the microfinance industry, not only based on different regions, different countries, but also different cost structures. Now, of course, there is this issue that's complicated about cost, that interest rates are always related to something that is called a average balance. So I think it's fairly intuitive to say that the smaller the average balance, then the larger that interest rate tends to be. In fact, an interesting read, a book just published when another colleague and researcher, among them Jonathan Murdoch, called The Portfolios of the Poor, they actually talk about, when they talk about pricing of microfinance, about a concept that I found very intriguing, because it's also it kind of resonates with what we wrote in Letter to Our Peers, which is when you look at the actual fees for people to have access to a microfinance loan, in absolute terms, they tend to be fairly small. So to give you an example, an average microfinance client in Latin America will pay between $400 and $600 a year to have that loan. To put that in context, an average client in Compartamos will pay about $200 for having that loan for a year. Now, even though in absolute terms those $200 is smaller than the $600, in terms of interest rate, it might be higher depending on the loan amounts that those loans are able to deploy. For example, those 400 to 600 fee, if you will, can get you on average in Latin America a loan of $2,000, where in fact the average outstanding balance in Compartamos is closer to $300. So that relates to a larger interest rate, even though it's a smaller fee. So again, very, 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 very much sensitive around the loan amounts and the average outstanding balance, which is, I guess, one of the key takeaways of this study that we just heard from Dean. Which again, again throws us into the arms of trying to study demand. So it's of course, doing every effort from the cost side of being as effective and as efficient as one can. But when that $200, let's say, as a cost is pretty much fixed, then what can you do not to lower that $200, but to provide more or lower interest rate actually means providing a larger loan amount for clients. And again, this whole notion that, microfinance in Mexico is charging what the market can bear is, I think, very, very far away from the truth from this set of data that we've had here, when in fact one looks at demand from the client's perspective. And again, what we found from this study is that the client is sensitive to pricing, contrary to common knowledge in microfinance. But what we also saw there, by the competitive response, for example, or by the fact that there wasn't really a difference between take-up and retention in the direction that we were expecting, that I think it's fair to say also that there are other features within those products where the client is sensitive at. And I don't think we have enough evidence as of now to say, well, is the client more sensitive to pricing than to other features? We know that the client is sensitive to pricing. We now need to go and get the evidence and the data about how sensitive they are to other features, which is something that we're actually working out with Dean. And when I mention other features, it's things like the loan term, like loan amounts, like frequency of payments, like the fact that you have or you don't have a social collateral behind it. So those kinds of issues are also sensitive to the client. Again, one cannot underestimate the obvious that a lower interest rate is in fact better for the client than a higher interest rate in terms of their own cash flow. How sensitive they are, how much that plays into their take-up or to the retention or even to the loan amounts is what we try to find out, and that's what got us this data. And the way, from Compartamos' perspective, this is very valuable data to then go ahead and implement or keep implementing our pricing strategies and structures. So basically the takeaway is, when we lowered these interest rates, as Dean mentioned, on average 10%, we got a growth in number of clients of about 20% and a growth in the loan amount of about 10%. That is what actually brings that. Even though it's a lower interest rate, it relates to more clients with a larger loan, so therefore the income from that group is larger than from the higher loan amount, for the higher interest rates. Now, let me bring you back to the point I was trying to make about loan size. So specifically what you're seeing here is that we are able to have a net positive effect on income because we are able to charge a lower interest rate on a net increase in the loan amount of about 5%. So again, we come back not to lowering interest rates just because of the efforts that we've done and we keep doing on lowering costs, but because we lend more money to clients at a lower rate. The other side of the issue again, and we've seen what that can do in terms of demand. What the other side is cost. And as Dean just mentioned, the picture there is a bit mixed because in fact the whole idea of providing a larger loan amount at a lower interest rate and trying to at least have a zero effect in terms of income is to try to have a small effect, if not a negative effect even, in cost. And what we see there is that if this higher take-up of clients requires us to have more groups, which are the key driver of the cost, as you all know, in microfinance, the operational costs are, most of the cost of servicing a client, and the labor cost is most of that cost, and the labor cost of serving those groups, having the loan officer travel to that community, spend an hour or two with that group, and go through the whole methodology every single week, in our case, is what drives our cost. So when you actually create more groups to service that larger group of clients with a slightly larger loan amount, then the cost pretty much makes up for the net positive increase in income. If you, on the other hand, are able to bring in more clients into existing groups, again, like Dean said, those fixed costs are mostly taken care of, and therefore there is an increase in income from that group without such an increase for servicing that group of clients. So again, very, very specific data, like Dean mentioned, that probably is not comparable to even our nearest competitor, or just this, obviously not to the whole microfinance industry, but that it allows, first, to go deeper and in a lot more detail into these discussions of pricing, and secondly, it allows institutions like ourselves to understand better where the drivers are or where the sensibilities of our clients are. So I'll just finish up this remark, and I think we have some time for Q&A, by saying that, yes, the whole game, therefore, if Compartamos, which has, without tax, an annual effective interest rate average of 73%, if we want to bring that down, which is something, and by the way, it's gone down about 400 basis points every single year, not only because loan sizes as portfolios mature increase, but also because of efficiency gains throughout the years. If we want to keep that trend, if we want to keep lowering interest rates, probably not just the best path has to do with, again, serving demand better. And one needs to question, again, what you've seen in this data is we dropped 10% the pricing and we got 20% more clients, 5% more of an average loan. Now, how can we now use that to say, okay, let's try to get 10% more loans or 20%? Because, just for very basic analysis, if we were able not to lend $300, but to lend $600, our cost would be half, and our interest rate, in theory, could be half. The real question here is, and this is what we try to measure through this, is what happens when you lend, you cannot artificially lend twice the money to a client that, can most probably not repay. So there is a limit to what you can do there. I once heard somebody very recently say something very wise, because he was speaking about how we all see these productive loans as holier, if you will, than consumption loans. And he said, I don't really buy that good loan, bad loan stuff, except for one thing. A good loan, the definition of a good loan is a loan that the client can repay. And a bad loan is a loan that, regardless of the amount, regardless of the interest rate, the client cannot pay. So again, the major risk here, and we've said this in our letters to our peers, is when we hear a lot of our critics even say, well, you should drop your interest rate faster, what we're actually hearing them is you should push more money out the door to those clients, because that's in fact the first way we could actually achieve that. But again, how elastic is that, or what is the breadth of that margin there? We've seen a 5% increase with the same clientele, but if we probably go for an increase of outstanding balance of 20, 25, 30%, then we're probably looking at a different market segment, which is not the market segment that Compartamos was born to serve. So again, let me just finish up by saying that it has been, for us at least, as we've increased the number of research and the intensity of the research that we do within Compartamos, it has really been tremendously transforming in the sense of what we know about our clients, how we can better serve our clients, and how we can disseminate this information to the industry and to the general public. This isn't the only study we're doing. We have a an ongoing, very ambitious impact study. As Dean mentioned, this study you just saw is not really social impacts. We're doing a very deep, 2-3 year long impact study, which, like this study and every research that we do, we plan to make public regardless of what it actually says or doesn't about our work. And again, I think we're a much better place now than we were a few years back, where most of our discussions were really lacking the evidence, we're really lacking the data, and we're just starting. But I think our conversations and our debates are going to be a lot more enlightened in the next few years if we keep doing this kind of work. Thank you.